Okay, so we saw that some people want to go ahead and focus on outcomes or consequences. Those are the utilitarians. Some people want to focus on the means, and roughly speaking, these are our two varieties of Kantians or deontological. So you can go ahead and laugh as I try to spell this. Deontological moral thinkers. And both of these are sort of focusing on different parts of a sentence. And sort of my analogy here would be, let's suppose that, Bill saves Ted from drowning. The utilitarians focus on what happened. The Kantians are going to focus on whether Bill did it by a fair means or not. And so you can sort of go, okay, well then, in that case, mostly what we care about is outcomes. On the other hand, if it's a matter of Bill made a lot of money, then really we care a lot about means and maybe less about outcomes. I mean, maybe Bill cares a lot about the outcome there. But the rest of us maybe care, well, gee, how did Bill come to make a lot of money, rather than the outcome itself. And so they're both sort of looking at different ends of the elephant. There's sort of a third way of looking at it, and that's what's called essentially a virtue ethical approach. And virtue ethical people are essentially saying, and this sort of, oversimplifying, what is good is being a good person. Oversimplifying here. And typically they say the problem with some of these approaches is that they're only looking at part of the picture here. So in particular, the idea would be that these people are almost entirely focused on justice. And the utilitarians, a virtue ethicist might say, are almost entirely focused on what we might call prudence, on sort of what is the most efficient way of getting to some outcome. But there are lots of other important things in life. So, we care about compassion. We care about courage. We care about lots and lots of different things out there. We care about truth. We care about, does someone have a commitment to an overarching goal? Lots and lots of things out there. And so, this is another way of looking at it. So we had Rawls, who had theory of justice. We have Nozick, who had anarchy, state, and utopia. There's lots of people who've written things on utilitarianism, and again, sort of almost everything you look at in economics, that's sort of the de facto way of looking at it. One book to read here that's a book on ethics written by an economist is, and I'm going to have to check my spelling on this, G-O-I-S. The Bourgeois Virtues by Mccluskey. Sort of trying to sort of broaden this ethical scope beyond just looking at prudence and just looking at justice. Then sort of a last ethical school, we could sort of say, that's not easily categorized in this way is what's called communitarianism. So communitarianism. All of the preceding ethical schools that I talked about previously really sort of were ethical individualists that sort of, they treat the object of utility to be maximized as each particular individual and then just add up across individuals. Or Nozick says, we want to go ahead and think about individual rights and that you don't cross anyone's individual rights. Or Nozick says, let's go ahead and maximize the primary goods available to the most worst off. So we're concerned about the welfare of those particular individuals. So communitarianism basically is less individualistic. And sort of, I think we think of individualistic as being synonymous with perhaps being something sort of libertarian or right-wing or that sort of thing. I think if you look at the utilitarian ways of reasoning or Rawls's way of reasoning, they're very much not necessarily so. So you could be sort of a sort of individualistic person or someone who's concerned about the welfare of individuals, or you can be someone who's concerned about the welfare of the whole, which is to say you're looking at things holistically. And a sort of big question is the welfare of the whole just the sum of the parts? And communitarians would typically say no. The welfare of the whole is something different than the welfare of the parts. And, this is, I think, an interesting question. Are there things that somehow they would maybe not be good for all the individuals in a population? In fact, maybe they would be bad for all the individuals in a population, but they would lead to a more cohesive, higher functioning society as a whole. Again, not something I can give you the final answer to, but I think it's at least an interesting question. Or, is it possible for wholes, organizations or whole societies to have what we call moral agency and moral responsibility? A communitarian would typically say yes, there is such a thing as a community being responsible, even if no particular individual has a responsibility to act in a certain way. And so essentially communitarians are going to say that, well, we should look at what is consistent with an overall scheme of life in a community's values. One of the criticisms here is essentially that this doesn't give us that much specific moral content. The way of life that's consistent for the American South before the Civil War might have been that, 70% of the population believed slavery was right, and, therefore, are we going to say that it was right for the American South to practice slavery? So what happens sometimes under communitarianism is it's sort of vulnerable to the critique that it supports whatever the current social status quo is. Because presumably, whatever a society does is whatever it wanted to do, otherwise it wouldn't have done it. And therefore we get into this problem of, are we ever in a position to actually say that something's wrong if it happened? I'm also being a little bit unfair here to this, but that is sort of the criticism that people make of it. The book to read here is by Michael Walzer and is called Spheres of Justice. So you can go ahead and ask for that for Christmas and get your grandma to give you that exciting book. Actually, it's a pretty good read compared to some of the other books I've talked about here. It's much, much more readable. This and the Mccluskey book are the two most readable books that I've brought up so far.